Hello, Garland Nixon here. It's Tuesday morning. We're hanging out with Joti Brar. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we are hanging out with Joti Brar. We got a number of things to talk about. We got an hour. We're going to talk about my trip, but before we get going, I do have a question for Joti, a thought. And this is about this, just to get comments from you. And this is about this so-called 19-point plan, 20-point plan, and the Europeans are saying no, and the Ukrainians are saying we can't sign, it's got to be different. And here are my thoughts when it comes to imperialists. They use proxies all of the time. And I think the big problem they have is this. If you and I have a contract, the issue is never whether or not we put our names on the contract. It's whether we can execute the contract. Right? Well, Zelensky can sign anything. I can sign something that says, I'll give you $1 billion if you smile. And then you smile. But I can't execute the contract because I don't have the $1 billion, right? I don't have access to that. There's a reality that I think the Europeans are horrified of being exposed to the people. And that is, Zelensky's nothing but a puppet. And it doesn't matter what he signs because he can't execute it. He does not represent Ukraine. He represents MI6. Here's the problem they have. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, there's a 19, 20, 80 point, but whatever, how many points? Here's the plan. And they say, okay, we've decided that Zelensky says, I'm signing it. And he signs the plan. And then the Nazis and all the people back in Ukraine say, we're not paying any attention to that. And he better not come back to Kiev because we'll hang him, which they've already said. And what is exposed is that he has no authority in Ukraine. He's not even a puppet leader of Ukraine. He's a puppet representative of the crown, of the empire, right? And the way that would be exposed is if he were attempt to execute a contract, and then he was attempt to pretend, if I put my name, then the Ukrainians will do what I put my name to. So the bottom line being, he can't really sign anything because the truth is he doesn't work for Ukraine, and they can't have him make an attempt to represent Ukraine, and then the Ukrainians will make it clear that he does it. Anyway, your thoughts?
Thanks, Garland. Yeah, I look at this whole the peace plan shenanigans, whether it's in Gaza or Ukraine, I see the same thing. I just see publicity, hot air, and delusion. The forces on the ground are saying something entirely different than what President Trump and all of his pieces of paper are saying. And all of this stuff about how Washington and Europe and Ukraine can't agree is like, who cares? So what if they all come to an agreement, and they all agreed on what Trump has put forward? Would Russia sign that? No way. Russia is very diplomatic, and they make the point constantly, we're open to negotiations which address the root causes of the war. Does the document address the root causes of the war? No. Why doesn't it? It can't. Because if it does, it's a total admission of defeat. And defeat is what's happening. But they're all trying to manage the fact that they've been defeated. The Europeans are in complete denial about the fact they've been defeated. And the reason they scream the loudest is because they can't keep the war going unless the US is still in. Right? That's the reality. They can't keep it going without the US weapons, without the US approval for keeping it going. So they could keep it going in a low level if the US continues to supply weapons and let them have the codes for all of the access to all the information and all that stuff that they need. We know now, don't we, that you can't use American weapons unless the Americans are like green lighting you to actually fire them and pick the targets and all the rest of it, right? So they need the USA's participation in some form or another. The USA is trying to manage a face-saving withdrawal that says we didn't lose, we brought peace. That's That's what Trump is trying to be the front of. But that was a strategy that was clear. It was one of the reasons I think the ruling class opted for electing Trump in the USA in the last election, because they needed to be able to say, we didn't get defeated in Ukraine. There was a change of government and the government changed the policy. The policy didn't change, but the reality has changed. The reality is NATO, the combined forces of NATO, have been defeated by Russia alone on the battlefields of Ukraine. And all of this hot air and shenanigans is to try to create a narrative that says something different. But, you know, when it comes to Zelensky himself, you know, he's a puppet, he's an actor, he's a stooge. From his perspective as a stooge president, he is hemmed in all directions. On the one hand, as you say, he doesn't represent the mass of Ukrainian people. He was voted for by them back in the days when he was presenting himself as a peace candidate who was in favor of good relations with Russia. That was when he could win an election, because he gave that lying message, and the people had been massively propagandized and what's the word, manipulated into believing he was some outsider and some real kind of man of the people, servant of the people. Wasn't that his TV show, right? So, you know, they'd had a massive psyop done on them, essentially. But the general feelings of the Ukrainian people when they voted for Vladimir Zelensky was, we want friendly, neutral relations with the EU and with Russia. That's been consistently the message that modern Ukraine gave to the world through its elections and through all kinds of things, you know, ever since the days when it voted to stay in the Soviet Union but was ignored, right? Then as an independent country, even with all the, you know, gangsters and compradors who are running the show, consistently at elections, the Ukrainians would choose candidates who would say, yes, we'll be friendly with the EU. And EU is always presented as like free travel and good jobs, right? Yes, we'll be friendly with the EU, but we'll also be friendly with Russia. We'll maintain our neutrality. Those were always the candidates that the masses of Ukraine voted for, you know, and that was consistently, you know, the favored position of Ukrainian people. That's why they had to be couped not once, but twice. Let's not forget that 2004 was the first coup. 2014 was the full successful coup, but not quite successful enough, was it? Because the Donbass rebelled against the second coup and said, no, 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 no. We have our roots in Soviet history. We are Russian speakers. We are, you know, loyal to the memory of the Soviet Union and to our Russian heritage. And there is absolutely no way we are having a fascist regime run by imperialists who want to turn us into slaves, foisted on us, and who want to turn Russians into second-class citizens so that they can prepare the Ukrainian people to see Russia as an enemy that they have to fight. Right, so they didn't accept it. So even the 2014 coup, you know, one of the things that London especially has been desperate to see through, and the Biden, you know, well, in fact, from Obama onwards, but, you know, successive US regimes also were really upset about the fact that Crimea was lost immediately. And they couldn't even fight for that because there was a Russian base there. But the Crimean people, because there was a Russian military presence, couldn't be stopped from holding the referendum where they just rejoined Russia peacefully. And, you know, the part of the war aims was actually to reverse that. That was what NATO thought they were going to get when they launched this war. They thought they were going to get regime change in Russia, and they thought they were going to get direct occupation of the Crimea Peninsula, which is very significant, important for military and strategic purposes on the Black Sea. So, you know, we're seeing the final disintegration of all of NATO's plans. Zelensky doesn't represent the feelings of ordinary people. He, on the other hand, has had to rely on, as a local force to prop up his regime and his rule, he's had to rely on Nazis. Those Nazis have been funded, and as we know, and supported and developed by Western forces. But they also have their own kind of ultra-nationalist logic. And that, of course, it's all based in absolute vitriolic, vicious hatred for Russia and all things Russian and all Russian people. So they can't accept defeat. They'll keep, hurling people into the battlefield for as long as possible. They've been trained to think that way because it served the interests of imperialism. So Zelensky is not in a position to sign anything or argue about anything. But when we see him fighting, what we really see, I think, is London. Is the Europeans saying, no, USA, if you walk away from this, we're in big trouble. They need that war to be a victory, and they can't face up to what happens to them if it's not a victory. What happens to, British, French, German finance capital, how much its crisis is deepening and will be deeper still if they don't have the prospect held out to them of an imminent looting bonanza of Ukraine and then Russia's vast wealth. If they, instead of that looting bonanza, have it shown to the entire world that their military prowess is hollow, that a real military can stand up to them and beat them. This is huge in terms of what it does to the mindset of oppressed peoples all over the world. We've already talked about before, haven't we, how the special military operation created the space in which the people of the Sahel felt more confident to rise up, in which the people of Gaza felt more confident to rise up, because not only NATO was being pinned down and distracted and occupied, and its weapons being used up in Ukraine, NATO was being defeated in Ukraine. Imagine what the message that sends to all the people who, since the fall of the Soviet Union, have been led to believe that they have no option but to come to terms with American supremacy. And now they're like, hang on a minute. American supremacy is not so supreme after all. And the powers that are rising in the world are not imperialist powers. And we've got options. We've got friends who can help us build infrastructure. We've got friends who will do trade with us and won't demand that we put our people into debt slavery. We've got friends who will help us to arm ourselves in our own defense. Okay. And guess what? The imperialists can be defeated. They don't even have the best weapons on the planet anymore. They might have the biggest military budget. For years and years, we were blackmailed. The whole world's population was kind of cowed by seeing these graphs all the time. Now, they used it to complain about the USA's ridiculous military spending, but it also gave the impression that the USA, by spending 10 times as much as like the rest of the world put together, or whatever the graph used to say, I forget, but it was kind of ridiculous, wasn't it? You see those bar graphs, and here's US military spending, and then here's the next 5 countries. The impression it gave was they're also that much more mighty, right? They're that much more mighty. You can't stand up to them. Now we know they're not more mighty. The Russians have weapons, even the Iranians, the DPRK, the Chinese, these people all have weapons that the USA has no answer to. The USA might spend an insane amount of money on arms, but what it turns out is most of that's going in kickbacks, corruption, and just overpricing by monopoly corporations. It's not going to create the best armed forces or even the best weapons in the world. So everything has changed with the defeat of NATO in Ukraine. I have a strong suspicion that in the end, Zelensky is going to have to do the same kind of runner in a helicopter, if he can manage it, stuffed with dollars, that old Hamid Karzai did when he ran away from Afghanistan.
Yeah, that's been my prediction. I predicted exactly that. 2 years ago, I did a video and I said they're going to exercise the Samsonite option. They're going to pack their bags and make a run for it. So we're, another
any choice.
Yeah, another thing that I think is important is this is kind of the death of the speculative fictitious capital system, because the big terrible thing that happened is they said, we're going to take Russia out, take them off the Swift bank, blah, blah, blah. They won't be able to do this. And people came to realize, well, wait a minute. They have hard stuff. They have steel. They've got nickel and copper and wheat and oil and gas and things, and people still need those things. And now this argument that the monetarism, finance capital, speculation, that was the way to get rich, and that was the power in the world. And now people are saying, wait a minute, if you've got wheat and sugar and rice, you're fine. So what's even horrible is they were like, even their discussion, we can take Russia out. How? Another 100 billion, another 200 billion, another 300, another 50 billion. So they were like, if we throw more money into this, Russia will be defeated by the money, almost like the money would somehow defeat artillery on the battlefield. And what people are finding out is, put $50 billion in a bank and put some artillery shells in an artillery, hand them to the artillerymen, artillery wins every time. That it took people back to the concept that economy is physical, and that, as Marxists argue about, material realities are coming to dominate the conversation again.
Totally. You know, it's a sign that people don't understand economics, that they fell for the idea that you can make money out of thin air. You can't. You never could. What has confused people is the fact that we live in the very advanced, very decaying, historically speaking, stage of monopoly capitalism, of imperialism, whereby almost all, I mean, I'm making a big sweeping generalization, right, but, you know, the vast majority of production of the formerly advanced industrial countries, which were the ones that became imperialist, has all been outsourced to other places. Now, that works brilliantly in terms of maximizing profit for the owners of finance capital. They're in Britain, they're in France, they're in Germany, they're in America, right? Works brilliantly for the owners of finance capital, i.e. what they like to call the banksters, yeah? Works brilliant for them as long as everyone in the world knows their place. Because basically, which is why we hear US and British politicians saying, they can't do what they want, they're sitting on our oil. They can't do what they want. They're sitting on our wheat. They're sitting on our gold. They're sitting on our rare earths, right? As far as the business owners, corporate owners, bank owners are concerned in the West, those are ours. Those resources belong to us. They're how we make our money. It's cheaper for us to produce things abroad and import it, and because we own the production facilities and the wages are so low and the land prices are so low that the profits are enormous. Right. So that's, and then, of course, you know, if you can control the governments of territories or just govern them directly yourselves, you can loot raw materials without even paying anything like a kind of royalty to the state. That's what we found out about Niger, right? About the uranium, that they were getting less than 1% of the value, and it was all basically going to Paris. That is a vivid illustration of how imperialist economics works. That's why the imperialists are so rich. It's not financialization, which is a kind of made-up word to cover imperialism. Imperialism is the looting of other people's wealth, or based on the fact that you export capital, invest it in production abroad, and bring the profits back home. So the profits don't stay where the resources and the workers are who produce that wealth. They come back to you, and then you do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again, and you've made a machine for looting the world. And it's a very strong machine. We mustn't imagine that it isn't strong, or that, you know, this power isn't real. The power of the finance capital of Britain, France, America is incredibly strong. So we can't underestimate that. But at this advanced stage, when the national liberation consciousness of the masses is so high, and the outsourcing is so kind of complete, suddenly you see the weakness in the system. They deindustrialized themselves. And it was all based on the assumption that the rest of the world would stay enslaved. But the rest of the world will only stay enslaved if you have the supreme military to back up your huge finance. They no longer have the supreme military, Garland. This is what the Ukraine war has taught us. they started to be undermined after the October Revolution with the rise of the Soviet Union. We've talked about this before, haven't we? But we see it again with the fall of the Soviet Union. They were triumphal, the imperialists. Ha ha, look, you see, you can't get free. Give it up. And a bunch of national liberation fights got put on hold in the 1990s and even reversed, because it really, at that time, the real balance of class forces in the world had shifted massively away from the workers and oppressed peoples. And they just had to live with a very difficult situation. There were very few countries or struggles that survived intact through that period. That's what's so amazing when you look at Cuba or the DPR of Korea, especially, how they withstood incredibly dire conditions. And the DPRK has been the one that survived the best in terms of keeping, completely intact its socialist economy. They didn't turn to, Cuba was forced to turn to tourism. DPRK didn't have to do that. They had a heavy industry. They were able to be self-sufficient. And I just want to come back to what you were saying about economies. To be a self-sufficient economy that's resilient and able to withstand shocks, you need to have certain things. You need food security. You need to grow your own food and be able to feed your own people and not be able to be held to ransom by external powers throttling your food supplies. You need to have decent technology, in particular in weapons, so you can defend yourself. You need to have energy security, again, to stop you being held to ransom and throttled by hostile external powers. And you need your own industrial base. And in particular, what that means is you need your own heavy industry, because heavy industry is the basis for all other industry. And if you don't have a heavy industry, you're not self-sufficient. You're not able to provide the modern goods for your people. So these are all things that proper socialist countries understand. If you look at the DPR Korea, if you look at China, if you look at the Soviet Union, you see that consistently that's what they focused on. And that what we saw with China and Russia, in a way, it was very helpful the way the West carried on, because they did a lot of saber rattling and a lot of early skirmishing into sanctions attacks on those two countries, trying to intimidate them out of opting for a sovereign path. What that did was not stop them being sovereign or aiming for sovereignty. What that did was warn them to look for the susceptibilities in their economy and shore them up. And that's been the basis of their resilience in the modern, last few years, when the sanctions attacks have ratcheted up to kind of, stratospheric levels. Russia in particular had 10 years to prepare for that onslaught, and it had a Soviet heritage to lean into. It had, if you like, you said this to me last time, it had muscle memory.
Yes.
Of knowing how to be a sovereign, independent state, as in having a technological base, having an industrial base, having an agricultural base, being able to self-sufficient in food, high technology and weapons, all these things it was able to lean back into as a direct result of its Soviet heritage. The leaders can be as anti-communist as they like, but they owe all their successes to the Soviet Union and the legacy of Soviet socialist planning. And that's just a fact, right? That's enabled them. So when you talk about, this, a real economy stands up. Yeah, it's absolutely true. You're seeing, I joke sometimes with my comrades that by the time we're able to make a socialist revolution here and wanting to build a real economy here again and not live off looting the world, and the rest of the world presumably at that point is anyway not going to be up for being looted by British finance capital, we can dispossess the money bags and say, right, the banks belong to us now. But fundamentally an economy is not made of money. An economy, as you say, is made of real wealth, real goods produced by people for consumption. And that real wealth, if you're going to make it domestically, has to rest in the things that I talked about. And the truth is, we are going to be begging to China to help us reconstruct our heavy industry and our industrial base, which has been entirely dismantled and exported in the interests of a tiny minority of the people, and has left us, as you say, extremely vulnerable. You know, big shocks are coming to the people of Britain, and they're going to be really surprised to discover how unresilient our economy really is. It's completely reliant on cheap imports from the rest of the world, for a lot of our, you know, for the cheap end of our food, and especially for fruit and vegetables. I notice, you know, we don't grow that many of them in Britain. The reason being that it's cheaper to do that because it's labor intensive. So labor intensive agriculture is done abroad, and we import, you know, most of the fruit and veg, and especially the fruit and veg that are eaten by poorer people because it's cheapest. And, you know, we're importing, you know, almost all of our consumer goods. So what is going to happen if we find ourselves cut off from that supply is going to shock British people very much, I think.
You know, one of the things I'd like to talk about a bit is Belarus and going to Minsk, because I went there and the people were pretty clear. I'm like, oh, tell me about your country. They're like, well, we're a socialist country right off the bat, right? Let me say this. It is the most rational place I've ever been in my life. You know, as a country, number one, spotless, absolutely spotless. I felt like I could drop my sandwich on the ground and pick it up and eat it. You know, I mean, I'm being facetious, but you get my point. Everything is so organized, clean. The people are very healthy. I was like, oh, the food's great. They're like, okay, there's no additives, no insecticides, no GMO food. None of that stuff's allowed in our country. And I'm like, so I'm basically eating everything organic. They're like, yep. I'm looking around the people, they're walking. Lots of people walk. It's part of their culture. Here's an example. Like, we go into Minsk and I see this unbelievable building. I'm like, oh, wow, that's one of the most beautiful buildings in Minsk, right? Let me show you what the building looks like. This is this building, right? Little better picture. There we go, everyone. This is this beautiful building in Minsk, right? That's a library. It's a library. It's not the home of the Citibank and JP Morgan, and like it would be in New York. If you see a building like that in New York, it's Citibank, it's JP Morgan, it's Goldman Sachs or whatever. It's a stinking library for people to go in. And of course, all the latest technology for people to learn. That's their state library right there, right? And I'm like, unbelievable. And you go through there, the people, and I'm like, no, you know, what we're told. You look online, it'll say, Belarus, the last European dictatorship. And I'm like, but the people there kind of like their government. They support their government. Say Lukashenko, he's an interesting character. They like him. And when you look into him, I'm like, when I look into this guy, he's a pretty smart guy. He's not some crazy fool. He's a pretty smart guy. I talk to them and they have knowledge of their country. I'm like, so tell me about it. They're like, okay, we're a small country, but we're diverse. We build farm tractors, we build the big heavy equipment that they use for mining. Then we have our technology sector. Oh, we do a lot of dairy products. And they're telling me all the various things they're doing. And then they say, because we have to have a diverse economy, because if one thing goes down, it has to be redundant. If technology changes, well, we have to be able to have jobs for those people. Now, we're small. We're not really militarily able to defend ourselves, but we're a sister state with Russia, and we're very tight with Russia. So and they've like rationally considered their food issues, their education issues, their defense. They're like, and I'm like, so you guys are just like Russia? Oh no, our culture is different. And they're very proud of their culture. And they say, we're different. We're the Belarusians. We're not like the Russians in some ways. And they're not opposed to the Russians. They're just proud of their particular culture. But rationally speaking, they say, they got a big economy. They can buy and help our stuff and help keep us from suffering at the hands of sanctions. And of course, defensively, we're too small. We only got 9.5 million people being aligned with them. So when you listen, everything is rational. It's very well planned. It makes great sense. And I'm like, so I'm told that if I go to London or Paris, which there's, you know, suffering and addiction and filth and, you know, people spray painting graffiti all over the place. That's where I want to be. And I come here and it's clean. The people are happy. They have good jobs. They're being educated. They've got outstanding World War II memorials. They have a very, I didn't even realize that the Nazis killed like 1 out of every 4 people in Belarus and all these. So they've got all of these reminders. Don't forget, the Nazis are over there and they do bad things. Literally, they have this one huge World War II monument. Everybody who graduates from high school has to go to that monument, and they do some little ceremony to remember what happened, you know, to their people. And I'm looking and I'm like, man, this is a great place. People are, and you look around, the people actually, they walk all the time. Everybody's in good physical condition. Everybody's happy. My God. But I'm told that this is some, anybody just go start searching online and see what the Western stuff says about Belarus. It's like, oh, it's a terrible place. It's one of the best places I've been to on earth. I have to say that. It's clean. It's wonderful. You got to love Belarus if you go there.
Thanks, Garland. I need to visit Belarus, but what stands out to me is, you know, what you've been experiencing was constructed during the era of Soviet socialist construction. That rationality and approach to building an economy, to making sure that people live near to their place of work, so they walk everywhere, like you said, that's about, you know, planning a planned economy and rational setting up society and production in ways that benefit the people and allow the people to work, be useful, and provide for themselves the things they need. Now, I don't think that Russia today is a socialist economy. It doesn't have a fully planned, Belarus is not a fully planned economy now. It became capitalist after the fall of the USSR, but it took a different turn than Russia, that's for sure. And it was successful. Lukashenko has been in office now for more than 30 years. And he was basically brought in because the people wanted a leader who would preserve the good aspects of socialist planning and socialist industry and not destroy and dismantle it like was happening in many parts of the Soviet Union. So very much, you know, on the same time as they've had, you know, a lot of marketization and a lot of private enterprise and capitalist, you know, inroads to their economy, they have a huge state sector. And what they have done, as you said, is they have preserved their heavy industry, their big collective state farms. So they have the wherewithal to be self-sufficient as far as possible. And they still have, as you say, they kept the traditional approach to taking care of ordinary people, the kind of welfare state, if you like. So they're like a kind of hybrid economy right now, I would say. What's interesting is, for a long time, there was a big kind of West-backed liberal movement or current in Belarus, or significant, not big, but significant, which convinced people that, you know, it's a good idea to be more friendly towards the EU. And they were very similar in many ways to Ukraine, in that they didn't want to get swallowed up by Russia. They didn't want everything that was happening in Russia to be happening in Belarus. They tried to kind of stay neutral between Russia and the EU, and at various times kind of tried to play those two off against each other in order to maintain their own independence. And in some ways that worked quite well for them. They did better at it, certainly, than the Ukrainians did. They did better at defeating the nationalists in their midst. They did better at defeating the liberals. It's very noticeable or noteworthy that in the last general election, Lukashenko is hugely popular, and he got presidential election, I should say, he got like 84% of the vote, something like that. Could be 86, but it was, you know, it was in the 80s. It was a good number. The runner-up for the first time in a long time was the communist candidate. So previously, the runner-up has tended to be a liberal candidate, a pro-EU type of candidate. With the most recent color revolution attempt against Belarus and with the special military operation, the liberal trend in Belarusian politics has been really outed as a tool of the West in the eyes of the masses of the people. So, you know, their leaders are now all abroad or in prison. You know, they've been shown to be direct provocateurs and agents of the imperialists trying to regime change against the will of the people, right? Which, of course, is criminal. It's criminal to try to work with an outside force to regime change the government against the will of the people, right?
If I may add one thing, one of the principal provocateurs was a guy named Roman Protasic, right? And there was all of this. He was on a plane. He was leaving Belarus. The plane was forced down. The Belarus people took him off. It was all over. Oh, this poor guy. This is terrible. He was running a channel for the opposition. And, you know, he was one of the leading people for the opposition, right? And no, he wasn't. He was a Belarusian agent. It's come out. They gave him like all of these awards. So the Belarus intelligence had their guy that was running the of a huge portion of the opposition the whole time, which I think is hilarious.
That is hilarious. It reminds me very much of the very early days after the Russian Revolution, when Felix Dzerzhinsky, who was in charge of kind of intelligence for the new Soviet government, he was basically in charge of running a whole load of provocative organizations whose job was to kind of mobilize anti-regime forces so that, you know, he'd get them together and work out who they all were so he could, you know, get them arrested essentially. So yeah, they very successfully ran operations like that in the early days of the USSR, I know also. But just to come back to this question of, you know, what you saw in Belarus, I think it's really significant, isn't it, that you see this big, beautiful building in the center of the city, and what we expect is that's a temple to capital. And what you see in a country with a socialist past and socialist leanings is they build temples to knowledge. They build cathedrals for the people, not for the worship of Mammon. And that is something you see across the socialist world and even across the anti-imperialist world. I saw a beautiful video recently of a library in Iran. It was amazing. It was huge. It was beautiful. The architecture, I've seen the most. You should see the Central Library in Pyongyang. Phenomenal. Most beautiful, beautiful buildings. And the whole thing about, you know, this is knowledge for the people. We value knowledge and education. We value our people. We want to bring education and knowledge to our people. We want to empower our people. We're not trying to keep them in oppressed and miserable ignorance. Just your thing about the food, I think, is something quite significant. And here's something that a lot of people don't realize. This legacy of a healthy food culture still exists even in the most fascistized Eastern European countries. I was in Latvia last summer. And as you know, the regime there is completely controlled by, you know, London and Washington. You know, it's really fascistic, you know, rewriting and glossing over the crimes of World War II, you know, all of that, you know, resurrecting Nazis essentially and criminalizing communists, right? That's what the government of Latvia today is characterized by. And yet in Latvia, not only do they still have Soviet-style nurseries, which everybody uses, right? Because otherwise their economy would collapse. Like from the age of 2 to the age of, you know, go to school, you know, you have free nursery places and it runs from like 7 in the morning till 7 at night. Everybody uses it's like that, right? Because that's what people expect, because they don't understand that you don't get that in the West, right? That's just normal for them. But what I noticed everywhere was, like, when you went to a kind of motorway service station, it was a little restaurant, and there was a real, you know, couple of dinner ladies there, or, you know, canteen staff. It was a real canteen doing real hot food, cheap but sustaining food, real food, not fake food, not cheap. When we think cheap food in our country, it's not really food, is it? It's food-like substances. But this was cheap and food for ordinary people to get when they're passing by. And I noticed in the counter, they had this long row of, they looked like glasses of milk. I was like, oh, what's that? Oh, it's kefir. Kefir is very popular here. I was like, oh, that's interesting. It's a, you know, it's a fad food in the West, isn't it? Kefir, because they've realized that having good gut microbes is a good idea, right? And actually, we've destroyed all the bits of our diet that used to give us those. So now, you know, middle class people are into trying to be more healthy and have access to high quality foods. We'll get into, you know, kefir and kombucha and sauerkraut and all these things. Well, they have all those things built into their diet. In even in Latvia, and I bet in Belarus it's the same.
Oh, yes.
And what they told me, my comrades there, they said when it was a socialist, when we were part of the USSR, what tended to happen was all the different republics would share the things that they had, the traditional foods they had, which were really good. became popularized across the whole Soviet Union. So kefir traveled, across the Soviet Union from places where it originated to places, it just became popularized everywhere because this is really good for you and it's tasty. So it's just become part of national culture now in every part of the Soviet Union that kefir is good and you should drink it. And, it's on sale everywhere. And, there's lots of things like that, other fermented foods. And very interestingly, I saw that there's a book by a doctor who came from the Soviet Union to Britain and couldn't understand the rise in all the mental health conditions of young people she was meeting. And she did research that very few people have done, looking into the connection between the brain health and the gut health, and saying, you do know your diet is really broken here, don't you? And like that's really having a big impact on your mental health and your, the development of all these conditions. It's not just out of the blue. It's, it's connected to what you're eating and how you guys are living. But in the USSR, like I say, that healthy food culture was just normal. And so what you see in Belarus is they simply haven't allowed that to be destroyed. So you're getting a taste of, real Soviet socialist life when you see all these things.
The other thing that was interesting was these buildings, right? And they're built like, nothing would knock these buildings down. I even saw it in Moscow, where some of the places I went, and you go in these buildings and these things are unbelievable. And they literally referred to them. They'd say, these are Stalin buildings. And they'll basically say, well, this stuff was built during the Soviet Union and it was made to withstand anything. They talk about, and if you think about it, I know people in the US that have bought, new houses, and they pay some ungodly amount for this house. And you go in and you see them building the house, and it's like sticks and wood, like, a good wind would blow it down. It's built because what is the least amount of investment we can put into this house to sell it the most, right? And when you see these buildings that were built during the Soviet Union, and they literally call them Stalin buildings, right? These things, well, they were built to last. The elevators are a little small. They had small elevators. That's the only thing I have a problem with. But whatever the case may be, and all of these high rises, and a lot of high rises, and I found out, well, they were made houses and free houses and inexpensive housing for people. And going up was the easiest and most inexpensive way to do it. You build these high rises, everybody gets an apartment, people have a place to live, right? But the construction of them was absolutely incredible. And you realize people were building things not to make a profit. They were built to last. They were built for people to live in. They were built so they wouldn't fall apart. So when I build it, I don't have to come back and fix it later, because it's less expensive for me to build it solid, walk away, and that one's running. And then I can go on and build the next one.
Totally. There's a lovely article on my party's website, thecommunists.org, people, about housing in the Soviet Union. And one of the things that always sticks with me about the Stalin period in particular was that actually high-rise wasn't the preferred mode of solving the housing problems during the Stalin period. They tended to, of course, they built blocks of housing in general, but they tended to be sort of like 4 stories, 3 stories. So the idea was to have more human sort of proportions. They made a point of making sure they had lots of green around them. They'd always have big parks and places for people to play and leisure space all around them, and lots of internal facilities for the houses to share. And they tried to use local materials and local architectural styles so that wherever you were in the Soviet Union, although you could tell it was a Stalin era building, it also fit with the local customs and culture and materials and all the rest of it. What changed actually was after World War II, and especially after the death of Joseph Stalin, there was a shift towards high rises because it was kind of sold as, well, this is cheaper. And there was less of a sense of wanting to really invest in the people in the way the Stalin era had. If you go to Moscow today, I know, despite all of the building that's happened since the fall of the Soviet Union, the apartments that everybody wants that are the most desirable are the Stalin era apartments, because they are so nice to live in. The proportions are very human. They last a long time. They're nice buildings. Everybody wants to live in a Stalin apartment in Moscow. I know that.
I've noticed. One thing I've noticed about it. There's, like some city centers with a bunch of high rises, new ones, and there's some high rises here and there. But broadly, as you go across Moscow, as I said, there are clumps of high rises in it that'll be built in an area. You can tell they were all built together the same period, the same time. There'll be clumps here and there. And then there's the new areas, which are, look like the skyscrapers from New York or anyone else, with all the lights on them and the advertisements and stuff. But broadly, as you drive through Moscow, which is huge, a lot of the buildings aren't really that high. It's not like New York, where there's skyscrapers all over. They're in clumps of areas where they seem to have been put up together at the same time.
Yeah, totally. So that, you can see steady shifts. You definitely see different characteristics for different periods through the Soviet Union. But absolutely, and particularly in the Stalin era, the principle of, making it functional, but also nice to look at and live in. Did you know, for example, here's a fun fact, people. Did you know that it was the Soviets who invented the fitted kitchen?
No.
And the reason they invented it wasn't supposed to be a big show-off thing. The fitted kitchen, the original concept was to be in a small space, and it was supposed to be designed to minimize unnecessary movement. So the whole thing was about convenience for the person using it. And of course, it was complemented by public canteens. So you weren't designing a space for a woman to be imprisoned in, or a family member of whoever it was. You weren't really expecting people to spend much time in the kitchen. You were expecting them to do much more of their eating out in subsidized canteens, where they didn't have to do the cooking and the washing up. But if they were doing food preparation at home, the idea of the fitted kitchen was, let's make this as labor saving as possible in our current circumstances. So yes, it was the Soviets people who invented the fitted kitchen.
Something else I wanted to bring up, and that is interesting. So the support for the special military operation is ubiquitous, right? We were told people will be in the streets. Oh, they'll be, and they like found half a dozen people somewhere, and they, made it look like there was all of these people. When you go there, everyone supports the special military operation at any rate. So what I kept being told was, Garland, you've got to come see the volunteers. And I'm like, the volunteers? Who are the volunteers? Oh, we're going to go see the volunteers, right? So at some point, it's great. We're going to go see the volunteers. And I went to this. My driver took me to this, like a small warehouse area district. And we go in the warehouse. There's maybe 15 or 20 women, something like 15 women, and a couple of seniors, a couple of older guys that looked like they were maybe late 70s, maybe 80 years old. And they were working. Now, what they were doing was putting together things to go to the front for the special military operation, to go to the soldiers in the trenches. That's what they were doing. And apparently, they went through the community. They would collect money. People all throughout the community would donate, and they would buy things they were putting together. This is something they gave me, interestingly enough. Cheburashka. Apparently, this was a little cartoon that all of the people loved, and the soldiers, all like it's a good luck charm or something. They hang it from their, tanks and things like that, and so they make these by hand. If you can look, they made them. They made these things. They sewed them. They gave me a couple of, and all these different ways that they made them. These women sewed them and put them together and put the little eyes on them with buttons and stuff. Right? This is unbelievable. I saw this big thing of gauze because they were making small individual medical kits for the soldiers. And they were different size gauzes. And I saw this gigantic roll of gauze. I've never seen anything like it in my life. I'm like, I don't know, an industrial size. And this one woman sitting there, and she's cutting. They've got to have certain ones this long, and then somebody else would roll them up and put them in. Then they put the Band-Aids in. They put scissors. They put this. They put all the things on it. Both. That's a kit. They'd stack it up, boxes and boxes, literally hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of these kits. And I said, my gosh, that is a long roll of gauze. How long is that? And they said, about 3 kilometers. And they've got the whole thing by it. So, and I discussed it. The government has not asked them to do this. The government, the government gives the soldiers everything they need, but it is our duty to support the special military. Then they had a box truck. They pack it all in the box truck. It's off to the front, distributed, whatever the case may be. And then I had some friends here that are Russians that I work with Sputnik, and I'm texting, I'm saying, yeah, this is amazing. And they're like, yeah, they do it in my town too. Yes, all over Russia, everywhere. It's not that the government doesn't have what it needs. It is the people get together. We're at war. Nobody asks them to do that. They get together, they put money out of their own, they rent a space of their own, they work 24 hours. And it was interesting to me that it was women and seniors, that these are the people that, under normal circumstances, they don't go to the front, so they support the special military operation. It was absolutely incredible.
Yeah, and again,
and I thought to myself, the West doesn't have a chance. That's what I thought. Look, you got no chance when every last person is working on behalf of the military.
Totally. And I think you know, and I know this as well from my experience, that the Communist Party has been in the lead of this. And this,
yes, it was the Communist Party. Yes.
This taps back into, again, the folk memory, which, as you've said, is so strong in the former Soviet Union, in Russia, in Belarus, even in Ukraine. This folk memory is so strong of, the fight against fascism and the fight, how the people pulled together against these phenomenal odds. Remember the Nazi forces, the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, at the time, they were supposed to be the biggest and most advanced army and invincible army that the planet had ever seen. Nobody could stand up to these forces. That's what the propaganda was. Remember, they rolled over France in a few weeks, over the Netherlands in a couple of days. This was a force that everybody said was invincible. And the Soviet Union was only 20 years old and had been through, had worked incredibly hard and very fast and very intensively to get itself in a position where, because it knew it was going to be attacked. It knew it was going to be. Stalin famously gave a speech in 1931 to business executives saying, comrades, we have to up our tempo. Yes, we're doing amazing work, but we have to work harder and more intensively because we've got 10 years to catch up with the West. And right now they're 50 or 100 years ahead of us. They're 50 or 100 years ahead, and we've got to make up the difference in 10 years. And if we don't, we'll go under. That's what Stalin said to business executives in the Soviet Union in 1931. In 1941, they were invaded, right? So that's 10 years later. So it's an incredibly prophetic speech. But that was the approach of the Soviet Union. We know we're going to get attacked. We've got to build ourselves up. But it was an overwhelming enemy they were fighting. It wasn't a small thing. The forces that the Nazis could pull in weren't just from Germany. They came from all over, the fascist world, which, they took forces from Hungary, from Romania. They had their proxies in various places like Ukraine, who collaborated with them and helped them, like also in Belarus. There were people who went over to the fascists and were used as their proxies or were brought back in, who'd been emigres, who were brought back in. So you have this incredible battle to fight. The Soviet people have not only endured this incredible onslaught and sacrificed tremendously, but they have that memory of, we won against these terrible odds and we did it. That victory wasn't just for us, it was for socialism, it was for humanity. That, a lot of people don't realize that it was not unusual for Soviet soldiers to go into battle saying, for Comrade Stalin and the motherland. And what they meant was they were fighting not just for Russia or the USSR, but for socialism and for humanity. And they knew that. And that, of course, is a very uplifting experience. But as part of that, the whole society was mobilized. This was not like the wars over there and the people in the rear are living in peace. And so that's all fine. Everybody was part of the war effort. I would ask people, actually, since we're talking about the war, on my channel, Proletarian TV, there's just been uploaded a speech that was given at our recent October Revolution meeting by my comrade Vicky, and she talked about the role of women during the Great Patriotic War. The women across the communist world, so the partisans in the Soviet Union, in China, but in the Soviet Union, she talks about the fact that, when they moved Soviet industry from the west side of the country to the Urals, literally picked it up, dismantled everything, moved it, and who was it who put it all back together when it got to the east? She said that was women workers. They bolted that stuff all back together and got it all up and running so that they could provide the material to the front line. Remember, this was happening under attack. This was the most phenomenal operation. So all of this experience lives in the in the folk memory and in the kind of cultural DNA, if you like, of the peoples of the Soviet Union. And Russia really embodies that today. And it's, you see around, and constantly you see reminders that that is what is being lent into in order to mobilize society in support of Russia's war, which is an existential war against, you know, the entire imperialist camp wants to turn Russia into a colony, and the Russian people are standing up and saying no. And in order to achieve their victory, they are leaning heavily into all the things they learned from socialist planning, socialist construction, and the victory over the Nazis in World War II.
And, you know, part of it is they don't have to, because it happens automatically. You know what I mean? It's like, it's just there. It's like when the conflict started, the people knew what to do, you know, kind of like, you know, bird migration, where a bird is in Guatemala or something, and it flies to Maryland, and it has baby birds, and the mother bird dies, and the baby birds fly right back to Guatemala, where the mother came from, to like the same tree. How do they know that? But it's in there. So she doesn't have to explain them to it. It's there, right? In the same way, interestingly enough, the Russian government didn't have to call people up. Hey, the Nazis are back, and we need you to do this, 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 and this. They didn't have to. When the Nazis start goose-stepping around the border of Russia, the people say, oh, well, we know what to do. And they just started doing it. It happens without, you know, it's kind of the Zen thing, you know, action without thinking. It just kind of happens. And it's not like they discuss it like, okay, this is what we got to do. How are we going to do that? They just do it. And they are dedicated beyond. It is like it's a greater thing to them than their lives. They're part of something bigger, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think what you're seeing there is the fact that the mass, despite everything, the mass consciousness of the peoples in Russia is still a socialist consciousness. Socialism, you know, the economy as a socialist economy has in large part been dismantled, but they've had to reverse some of that dismantling in the present era in order to fight the war. That's really interesting, isn't it? So that, you know, they've done decades of anti-communism, but at the same time, they can't be as rabidly anti-communist as the countries that have been fully colonized, because they're trying to remain sovereign. And to remain sovereign, they need to mobilize the people on the side of the government. You know, a government in a country under attack from imperialism can't defend itself against imperialism and wage an all-out war against its own people, right? It's not going to work. The people need to feel the government in some ways represents them. Now, at the same time that there's lots of anti-communism and slandering of Lenin and blaming Lenin for all the problems that caused the war and all this kind of nonsense, you hear a lot of that from Russian kind of liberal commentators and even from the Russian government. Putin regularly makes silly statements about what Lenin did that was wrong. But the reality is that they have to increasingly resuscitate and lean into all the things that made the Soviet Union strong: the planned economy, the rational approach to even things like arms production, any kind of industrial production, where, you know, what's been the basis of the advanced capability of the Russians to flexibly ramp up their arms production like that when they need to. That's all based in what the Soviet Union founded, right? Soviet industry was based on always have spare capacity, build a bigger factories, have a bigger skilled workforce than you need at any particular moment, so you can ramp up and down production, and you've got space to do it in. So you're always thinking contingency planning. You always have stores of things. You know, something I heard someone talking about was like how there's a whole load of World War II kit that basically still works, and when they need it, they just get it out, you know, dust it off, and it's ready to go, and it all works. That's a legacy of the Soviet approach to things, which is you don't throw things away. What's the point of that? If it's good and it works, you keep it and you take care of it and make sure it's in working order for if you need it. And then when you do need it, here it is. And you see to what extent actually that nationalist Russia, that was trying to maintain its sovereignty in the face of increasingly hostile West that wasn't prepared for it to be sovereign, right? The West was only prepared to accept post-Soviet Russia that would allow itself to become a colony. And when it became clear that Russia was not going to allow itself to become a colony, they've become steadily more aggressive towards it. And the Russian government, despite itself almost, has to lean into all the things it learned, as you said, like a muscle memory, has to lean into all the things that actually are capable of enabling it to stand up. And one of those things, you know, is planning of certain key sectors of the economy. Another one is, you know, making sure that the people feel that they're on the same side as the government. And the best way to do that is to remind them of World War II. And the problem with that is, if you remind people about World War II, what you're also reminding them of is the superiority of socialism to capitalism and to imperialism. You're reminding them of what it was that held people together, was fighting for something bigger than themselves, better than themselves. But what you're also reminding them of is a system where the people were the rulers of society, the masses, the working class were the runners of Soviet socialism during that period. And that's what motivated and mobilized those people to perform such heroic feats.
Well, I'll just end by saying showing one thing, because we all have to get out of here. Well, it's not showing up. You can't see it. But anyway, there's an article, and it was meant to denigrate the Russian effort. And it says, Russia resorts to using World War II artillery due to shortage. Just, it wasn't. It's that it still works. So they just said, okay, we got a new war. And it wasn't rusted somewhere. They stored it all. They kept it oiled and ready to go. And they said, oh, we got a new war. We need artillery. Grab all the old stuff. You point it at the enemy and fire it, and stuff flies out of it.
Yeah.
It seems to me that that's a pretty good formula for success, and at least based on the result. So, but to the West, it's, oh my gosh, they're using old stuff. We've got to use this new stuff that we just invented that really, like, the barrel melts after five rounds. Literally, like these M777s, the barrel melts. They're not, but they cost a lot of money, so they accomplish what needs to be accomplished. At any rate, Joti, tell everybody where they can find all of your stuff.
Just before I do that, I just want to finally say what that shows you about the Soviet Union is it built things to work, it built things to last, and it kept things in running order. And I think that tells you everything about the difference, really, between production for use and production for profit. Okay, so you can find me at thecommunists.org. That's it, yeah. Thecommunists.org is my party's website. You can sign up there for email updates. You can subscribe to our newspapers, and I always recommend people to do that because it's much better to read physical literature than online. You can, of course, read all our stuff online, but I think it goes in better off paper, and particularly our books. We've got a bookshop there. We've got a education program that you can work your way through by yourself. If you're in Britain, you can join one of our study classes, get involved as a supporter. We have a TV channel called Proletarian TV. That's on YouTube, but it's also on Rumble and Odyssey. And our Telegram channels, my Telegram channel is just my name, Joti Brar, and my party's is The Communists, and follow us there.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for all of my Patreon people and everyone who donates. You see everything sliding across down the bottom. If you can donate to help the channel, that's great. Also, I've got a P.O. box. People mail me books and magazines and you name it. That's great, too. Thank you very much for that. And the most important thing that you all can do as part of the alternative media community is share this on all your social media platforms. We're out.